September 2, 1944. The Philippine Sea, 280 miles northeast of Samar Island. Lieutenant Commander David Richardson stood on the deck of the submarine USS Harder, binoculars pressed against his face, scanning the empty horizon for something that shouldn't exist. His orders were clear but seemed impossible. Find a needle in an ocean. Locate a single airman floating somewhere in 50,000 square miles of open water. The pilot had been shot down 16 hours earlier, and conventional wisdom said he was already dead. Sharks, exposure, or drowning would have claimed him by now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then Richardson heard it, a distant drone growing louder. From the south, flying barely 50 feet above the wavetops, came an aircraft that looked like it had no business being there. The WWII Catalina flying boat, painted and modeled blue and white camouflage, its twin engines roaring, skimmed across the swells with a grace that defied its ungainly appearance. The plane circled once, twice, then did something that made every man on the submarine's deck hold his breath. It landed on the open ocean in 12-foot swells, taxied directly toward a tiny speck that Richardson hadn't even seen, and within 3 minutes had plucked the downed pilot from the water. The engines roared again. The Catalina lifted off impossibly from the rough seas and disappeared back toward base with its precious cargo. Richardson would later write in his report that he had witnessed the most audacious rescue operation he had ever seen. What he didn't know was that this single rescue was merely one of thousands. By the time the war ended, these lumbering flying boats would save more than 4,000 Allied airmen from certain death in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. The Japanese High Command, which had studied American military capabilities exhaustively, had never anticipated this. They had planned for American fighters, bombers, and carriers. They had not planned for a rescue force that could reach anywhere in the Pacific within hours and land on the open ocean to retrieve downed pilots. This oversight would cost them dearly. The story begins not with triumph, but with a problem that seemed unsolvable. In early 1942, as American forces began their long campaign across the Pacific, military planners faced a devastating reality. Every bombing mission, every fighter sweep, every carrier operation resulted in aircraft losses. Pilots were being shot down over thousands of miles of open ocean, and the vast majority were never recovered. They simply disappeared into the Pacific, lost forever. The numbers were staggering and grew worse with each passing month. In the first 6 months of 1942, the Navy estimated that over 800 airmen had been lost at sea. Some died in their aircraft. Others survived the crash only to perish in the water, waiting for rescue that never came. The psychological impact on flight crews was devastating. Pilots knew that if they were shot down over water, their chances of survival were minimal. This knowledge affected combat effectiveness. Pilots became hesitant, less aggressive, more likely to break off attacks to preserve fuel for the return journey. The existing rescue procedures were inadequate to the point of uselessness. When a pilot went down, his wingmen would radio the position and circle as long as fuel allowed. Surface ships would be dispatched if any were in the area, but the Pacific was vast and ships were slow. By the time a destroyer reached the position, hours or even days had passed. The pilot, if he had survived the crash and managed to deploy his life raft, would have drifted miles from his last known position. Search patterns covered enormous areas with minimal chance of success. Most searches were called off after 24 hours, when the probability of finding anyone alive approached zero. Naval Command understood this was not just a humanitarian crisis, but a strategic disaster. Every lost pilot represented hundreds of hours of training, combat experience that could not be replaced, and a degradation of fighting capability. Experienced pilots were America's most valuable military asset in the Pacific theater. Losing them to the ocean after they had survived being shot down was an unacceptable waste of irreplaceable human resources. Various solutions were proposed and rejected. Some suggested equipping all aircraft with better flotation gear, but this added weight and did nothing to solve the problem of locating pilots in thousands of square miles of ocean. Others proposed stationing more surface ships along flight paths, but ships were needed for combat operations and could not be spared for rescue duty. Submarines were occasionally used for rescue operations near enemy-held islands, but they were few in number, slow to respond, and vulnerable when surfaced. The answer came from an unexpected source. In San Diego, California, a Navy officer named Adrian Marks was attending a routine briefing on search and rescue procedures when he asked a question that seemed obvious but had never been seriously considered. Why couldn't seaplanes be used for rescue operations? The immediate response from senior officers was dismissive. Seaplanes were reconnaissance aircraft, they were told, not rescue vehicles. They were too valuable to risk in combat zones. They were too slow and vulnerable to operate in contested airspace. Landing on the open ocean was far too dangerous except in perfect conditions. Marks disagreed, and he had the credentials to push back. Before the war, he had been a civilian pilot with extensive experience flying seaplanes along the California coast. He had landed on rough water many times and understood what the aircraft could handle. More importantly, he understood something the Navy brass did not. The PBY Catalina, while slow and ungainly, was one of the most rugged and versatile aircraft in the American inventory. It could fly for over 20 hours on a single fuel load. It could land and take off from water in conditions that would ground most seaplanes. It had a large crew compartment that could accommodate rescued personnel. Most crucially, it could reach anywhere in the Pacific Theater within hours rather than days. The Catalina had been designed in the mid-1930s by Consolidated Aircraft Corporation. The design process had been led by Isaac Ladden, a talented but relatively unknown engineer who understood that the Navy needed a long-range patrol bomber capable of operating from both water and remote bases. The result was an aircraft that looked bizarre but performed brilliantly. The high-mounted wing allowed the engines to be positioned well above the water spray. The distinctive parasol wing configuration provided excellent visibility for the crew. The hull was shaped to handle rough water landings. The twin engines provided redundancy and long-range capability. By 1942, hundreds of Catalinas were in service with the Navy, primarily used for maritime patrol, anti-submarine warfare, and reconnaissance missions. They were nicknamed Dumbo by pilots after the Disney elephant because of their ungainly appearance and slow speed. They were easy targets for Japanese fighters and flew most of their missions at night or in bad weather when enemy aircraft were less likely to intercept them. Using them for rescue operations in daylight over contested waters seemed suicidal. Adrian Marks spent weeks preparing a detailed proposal. He studied every aspect of Catalina performance, interviewed pilots who had made emergency water landings, and developed procedures for rescue operations that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. His proposal outlined a dedicated rescue squadron equipped with modified Catalinas, trained specifically for search and rescue, and positioned to respond rapidly to any downed pilot report. The aircraft would fly in pairs for mutual protection. They would be escorted by fighters when operating in contested airspace. They would carry additional survival equipment and medical supplies. Most controversially, they would be authorized to land on the open ocean to effect rescues, something that went against standard Navy doctrine. The proposal was forwarded up the chain of command where it sat on various desks for months. Senior officers were skeptical. The idea of risking expensive aircraft and trained crews to rescue individuals seemed inefficient compared to simply training more pilots to replace losses. The counterargument that experienced combat pilots were irreplaceable and that rescue operations would boost morale throughout the air wings made little impression on officers focused on production numbers and sortie rates. What changed the calculation was a single incident in May 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea. A Navy fighter pilot named Edward O'Hare had shot down 5 Japanese bombers in a single engagement, becoming one of the Navy's first aces of the war. 2 months later, during operations near Guadalcanal, O'Hare's wingman was shot down over water within sight of the task force. Despite intensive searches by surface ships, the pilot was never found. The loss affected O'Hare deeply, and he began advocating loudly for better rescue procedures. When O'Hare himself was shot down and killed in November 1943, the incident galvanized support for dedicated rescue operations. In early 1943, the Navy authorized formation of the first dedicated rescue squadron. It was designated VH-1, the VH standing for Rescue Squadron, and it was equipped with 12 PBY-5A Catalinas, the amphibious version that could land on either water or conventional runways. The squadron was based initially at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, positioned to support operations throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. Adrian Marks was given command with the rank of lieutenant commander. The challenges were immediate and daunting. The Catalina pilots assigned to the squadron were experienced, but none had trained specifically for rescue operations. Landing a Catalina on open ocean was considered an emergency procedure, something to be avoided except in the most dire circumstances. Marks had to convince his pilots that they would be doing this routinely, often in rough seas, sometimes under fire, and that their survival depended on mastering techniques that Navy training had taught them to avoid.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The first modification was adding extra survival equipment. The Catalinas were stripped of their bomb racks and depth charges. In their place, crews loaded additional life rafts, flotation devices, medical kits, food, water, and emergency supplies. The aircraft carried enough equipment to sustain 20 rescued airmen for several days if necessary. Extra fuel tanks were installed to extend the already impressive range. Radio equipment was upgraded to improve communication with downed pilots and with surface vessels. The most important modification was psychological rather than physical. Marks trained his crews to think of themselves not as pilots avoiding combat, but as emergency responders racing toward it. Speed was essential. Every minute counted. A pilot floating in the Pacific faced exposure, dehydration, shark attacks, and drowning. The faster a rescue plane arrived, the higher the probability of finding the pilot alive and conscious. Marks drilled his crews relentlessly on rapid response procedures. When a distress call came in, a Catalina had to be airborne within 15 minutes regardless of conditions. The first operational rescue came in March 1943. A Navy dive bomber had been hit during a strike on Japanese positions at Munda Point in the Solomon Islands. The pilot managed to ditch in the water about 30 miles from the target. His wingman circled and radioed the position. A Catalina from VH-1 was airborne 12 minutes later. The rescue plane reached the position in 40 minutes, spotted the pilot in his life raft on the first pass, and landed despite 8-foot swells. The crew pulled the pilot aboard, treated him for minor injuries, and flew him back to base. Total time from distress call to delivery at the base hospital was 93 minutes. The rescued pilot was back in the cockpit 3 days later. He flew 20 more combat missions before the war ended. This was the proof of concept that Marks had been arguing for. An experienced combat pilot who would have been lost under the old system was saved and returned to duty in less than 4 days. The cost was a few hours of flight time and minimal risk to the rescue crew. Word spread quickly through the air wings. Pilots learned that if they went down, there was a dedicated squadron whose only job was to come get them. Morale improved noticeably. Pilots flew more aggressively, pressed attacks harder, and spent less mental energy on contingency planning for ditching. They knew that someone was coming for them, and they knew it would be fast. The Japanese initially paid little attention to these rescue operations. Their intelligence services noted the presence of the slow-flying boats, but classified them as patrol aircraft of minimal importance. Japanese fighters occasionally intercepted Catalinas, but found them difficult targets. The flying boats flew low over the water where Japanese fighters had trouble following. They operated in bad weather when visibility was poor. They were escorted by American fighters when operating in contested areas. Most importantly, they were painted in camouflage schemes that made them nearly invisible against the ocean's surface from above. What the Japanese failed to understand was the cumulative impact. Every rescued American pilot flew again. Every rescue boosted morale throughout the fleet. Every survivor told his story, reinforcing the knowledge that America took care of its people. This was psychological warfare that the Japanese command structure, with its acceptance of death as an honorable end for failed warriors, could not comprehend or counter. By mid-1943, WWII had conducted over 50 successful rescues. Other squadrons were formed and deployed throughout the Pacific. WH-2 operated from Guadalcanal. WH-3 was stationed in New Guinea. WH-4 deployed to the Marshall Islands. Each squadron flew constantly, responding to distress calls, searching for downed airmen, and perfecting the techniques that would save thousands of lives. The procedures became standardized through hard-won experience. When a pilot went down, his wingman would immediately radio the position and circle as long as fuel allowed. The distress call triggered an automatic response. The nearest rescue Catalina launched within minutes. Fighter escorts scrambled to provide protection. Surface ships in the area moved toward the position as backup. The Catalina flew directly to the last known position at maximum speed, typically around 120 miles per hour. Upon arrival, the crew began a systematic search pattern based on wind direction, currents, and time elapsed since the pilot went down. Spotting a single person in the vast ocean was the most difficult part of any rescue. Pilots wore bright yellow life vests and deployed yellow life rafts specifically to improve visibility. But even these were tiny specks against the endless blue. Catalina crews developed techniques using the sun angle, searching into the sun where reflected light made floating objects more visible. They flew low, sometimes only 30 feet above the waves, where the perspective made it easier to spot debris or life rafts. The aircraft carried powerful binoculars, and crew members scanned constantly, sector by sector, in coordinated search patterns that covered maximum area with minimum time. Once spotted, the real challenge began. Landing a Catalina on open ocean required skill, judgment, and courage. The pilot had to assess wind direction, swell height, and wave patterns in seconds. The standard technique was to land parallel to the swells, touching down between wave crests. The hull would slam into the water with tremendous force. The spray would obscure all visibility for several seconds. The aircraft would skip once or twice before settling into the water. Then came the most dangerous moment. The Catalina would be wallowing in the swells, engines at low power, vulnerable to being swamped or capsized. The crew had perhaps 3 to 5 minutes to retrieve the downed pilot before conditions became too dangerous to remain on the surface. The rescue itself was conducted with practiced efficiency. As soon as the aircraft settled, crew members would deploy a rescue raft attached to a line. They would paddle or motor the raft to the downed pilot, help him aboard, and pull the raft back to the Catalina. In rough seas, this was terrifying work. Crew members were sometimes washed overboard and had to be pulled back by their safety lines. The downed pilot, often injured or in shock, sometimes could not help and had to be physically dragged into the rescue raft. Once the pilot was aboard the Catalina, the aircraft had to take off again, which was even more dangerous than landing. The pilot would advance the throttles to full power. The engines would roar. The aircraft would begin plowing through the swells, gaining speed agonizingly slowly. Spray would drench the windscreen. The hull would slam into each wave with impacts that threatened to break the airframe. The aircraft would shudder and groan. Then, if everything went right, it would lift off and climb away. If anything went wrong, if the engines faltered, if a wave caught the aircraft wrong, if the hull was damaged, the Catalina would crash, and everyone aboard would be in the water. The courage required to make these landings cannot be overstated. Catalina pilots knew that every water landing in rough seas was a calculated risk. They did it anyway because that was the mission. That was why the squadron existed. Every pilot they saved justified the risk. Every rescue made the next one seem less impossible. By August 1943, the rescue squadrons had developed a reputation that extended far beyond their small numbers. Fighter pilots and bomber crews throughout the Pacific knew the call sign Dumbo and what it meant. It meant that someone was looking out for them. It meant that going down over water was no longer a death sentence. It meant that the lumbering flying boats with their distinctive silhouette were the most beautiful sight an airman floating in the Pacific could see. The expansion of rescue operations accelerated as American forces pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory. New squadrons formed and deployed to forward bases throughout the theater. Each squadron operated with a core of 12 to 15 Catalinas. Though operational readiness meant typically only 8 to 10 aircraft were available for missions at any given time. Maintenance was constant and demanding. The Catalinas flew in corrosive salt air, landed repeatedly on water that stressed every rivet and seam, and operated from primitive island bases where spare parts and proper facilities were luxuries. The crews themselves were a unique breed within naval aviation. They were older on average than fighter pilots, more experienced, and often had civilian flying backgrounds. Many had been commercial pilots, bush pilots, or seaplane instructors before the war. They were men who understood risk management, who could make split-second decisions about weather and sea conditions, and who possessed the patience required for long search missions where hours of tedious flying might culminate in a few minutes of intense action. Each Catalina carried a crew of 8 to 10 depending on the mission. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit with excellent visibility through the large greenhouse-style windows. Behind them sat the flight engineer, who monitored the twin Pratt & Whitney engines and managed fuel consumption on missions that could last up to 20 hours. The navigator worked at a small table with charts, compass, and instruments, calculating positions and search patterns with slide rule precision. Radio operators maintained constant communication with base, with surface vessels, and with aircraft in distress. Gunners manned positions in the waist blisters and tail turret, though rescue missions typically avoided combat when possible. The most important crew member for rescue operations was often the plane captain, a senior enlisted man who supervised the actual recovery of downed pilots. These men were often experienced swimmers, sometimes former lifeguards, chosen for their physical strength and ability to remain calm in crisis situations. When the Catalina landed and wallowed in heavy seas, the plane captain would be the one leaning out of the waist blister hatch with a rope or boat hook, trying to grab a pilot who might be unconscious, injured, or too weak to help himself. Training for rescue crews intensified throughout 1943 as the squadrons expanded. New pilots spent weeks practicing water landings in progressively worse conditions. They learned to read the ocean's surface, to judge swell height and wave patterns from altitude, to time their landing approach to touch down in the trough between waves. They practiced emergency procedures for what to do when things went wrong, when an engine failed during takeoff, when the hull was damaged by rough seas, when weather closed in and visibility dropped to zero. The Catalinas themselves underwent continuous modifications based on operational experience. Additional armor plating was installed around the cockpit and crew compartments to provide some protection from enemy fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fire if the aircraft was hit. Upgraded radio equipment improved range and reliability. Most importantly, crews developed and shared techniques for improving rescue success rates. One innovation came from a crew that had attempted a rescue in 12-foot seas and found that the standard rescue raft was almost useless in such conditions. They rigged a cargo net along the side of the aircraft that downed pilots could grab and climb. Another crew developed a technique of taxiing upwind of a downed pilot and letting the aircraft drift down onto him rather than trying to maneuver the wallowing flying boat in rough water. These innovations spread throughout the rescue squadrons through informal channels and improved survival rates with each passing month. The Japanese finally began taking the rescue operation seriously in late 1943 after several incidents made clear what they were facing. In October, during operations near Rabaul, a Navy fighter was shot down within sight of a Japanese airfield. A Catalina appeared within 40 minutes, escorted by 4 Corsair fighters. Japanese Zeros scrambled to intercept but were driven off by the escorts, while the Catalina landed, retrieved the pilot, and took off again. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. Japanese observers were stunned by the speed and audacity of the rescue. Similar incidents occurred throughout the theater. Near Truck Lagoon, a torpedo bomber was shot down during a strike. The crew survived the crash and deployed their life raft. Japanese patrol boats were dispatched to capture them, but a Catalina arrived first, landed under fire from shore batteries, retrieved all 4 crew members, and escaped before the patrol boats could close the distance. The Japanese boats returned empty-handed, while the American aircrew were eating hot food aboard the rescue plane. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was significant and unexpected. They began to understand that shooting down American aircraft did not eliminate American pilots. Those pilots would return to fight again. This revelation was demoralizing to Japanese aircrew who had been taught that Americans were soft and lacked the warrior spirit necessary for sustained combat. The rescue operations demonstrated the opposite. Americans valued their people enough to risk expensive aircraft and trained crews to save individuals. This was a form of strength that Japanese military doctrine had not anticipated. American commanders recognized the strategic value of what the rescue squadrons were accomplishing. Beyond saving lives, they were preserving combat experience and maintaining unit cohesion. A fighter squadron that knew its pilots would be rescued if shot down fought more aggressively than one that expected losses to be permanent. Bomber crews that knew rescue aircraft were overhead during strikes focused on their targets rather than on contingency planning. The cumulative effect on combat effectiveness was measurable and substantial. By early 1944, the rescue squadrons were conducting operations that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The missions grew longer and more dangerous as American forces advanced deeper into Japanese territory. Catalinas flew missions lasting 15 to 18 hours, searching for pilots reported down hundreds of miles from friendly bases. They operated in weather that grounded other aircraft, flying through storms and low visibility because somewhere in that maelstrom, an American airman was fighting for survival. The statistics began accumulating. In January 1944, rescue squadrons throughout the Pacific conducted 47 successful rescues. In February, the number rose to 63. In March, during intensified operations supporting the invasion of the Marshall Islands, 91 airmen were saved from the water. Each number represented a life saved, a pilot who would fly again, a family that would see their son or husband return home. The most remarkable rescues often received the least attention. They were routine missions that went exactly as planned, which meant they seemed unremarkable to everyone except the man being pulled from the water. A fighter pilot would be shot down during a sweep over enemy territory. His wingman would radio the position. A Catalina would launch, reach the position in under an hour, spot the pilot on the first search pass, land and retrieve him within minutes, and return him to base before dinner. The rescued pilot would be back in the cockpit the next day. This happened dozens of times each month, and it became so routine that it barely merited mention in after-action reports. The extraordinary rescues were different. These were missions where everything went wrong and succeeded anyway through skill, courage, and determination. In April 1944, a bombing mission against Truk resulted in 3 aircraft shot down within a few miles of each other. 9 airmen ended up in the water scattered across a 10-mile area. A single Catalina responded and spent 7 hours searching, landing 6 different times in deteriorating seas to retrieve all 9 men. The aircraft was damaged during one of the landings, the hull cracked and leaking, but the crew kept flying until the last man was aboard. They nursed the crippled aircraft back to base, landed with water sloshing in the bilges, and discovered that the hull had been breached in 3 places. The aircraft was out of service for 2 weeks while repairs were made. All 9 rescued airmen survived. Another legendary rescue occurred in June during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A Navy pilot was shot down nearly 300 miles from the nearest American carrier. He was too far out for surface ships to reach in time. A Catalina launched from Saipan and flew through a tropical storm to reach the position. The pilot was found after a 4-hour search, barely conscious from exposure. The seas were running at 15 feet with winds gusting to 40 knots. Standard procedure said not to land in such conditions, but the rescue crew knew the pilot would not survive another hour. They landed anyway. The touchdown was violent. The hull slammed into a wave so hard that equipment tore loose and crew members were thrown against bulkheads. The aircraft settled into the water at a dangerous angle, one wingtip dipping toward the waves. The crew scrambled to retrieve the pilot before the aircraft capsized or swamped. They got him aboard and strapped him down. The pilot advanced the throttles for takeoff, knowing that if the aircraft didn't lift off on the first attempt, they would all die. The Catalina staggered through the swells, wallowing and shaking, engines screaming at full power. It lifted off after what seemed like an eternity, barely clearing the wave crests. The rescued pilot survived, and the rescue crew received Navy crosses for valor. These dramatic rescues made headlines and boosted morale, but the real impact of the rescue squadrons was cumulative and less visible. Between January and August 1944, as American forces advanced from the Marshall Islands through the Marianas toward the Philippines, rescue squadrons saved over 800 airmen. Each of these men represented dozens of combat missions worth of experience. Each one returned to the fight. The aggregate impact on American combat power was substantial and grew with each passing month. The Japanese attempted to counter the rescue operations, but found few effective methods. Shooting down the slow Catalinas was difficult because they flew low, operated in bad weather, and were escorted by fighters when in contested airspace. Japanese pilots who did encounter unescorted Catalinas often reported that the flying boats were surprisingly difficult targets. They could turn tightly at low altitude, they absorbed damage and kept flying, and their defensive armament was more effective than expected. Several Japanese fighters were shot down by Catalina gunners, who had learned to lead their targets properly and conserve ammunition for close-range shots. The Japanese also attempted to locate and capture downed American pilots before rescue aircraft could reach them. Patrol boats were stationed along probable flight paths and ordered to search for survivors. This was largely ineffective because the ocean was too vast and the American response too fast.
By the time Japanese patrol boats reached an area where an American aircraft had been shot down, the Catalina had usually already retrieved the pilot and departed. The few times Japanese forces did reach a downed pilot first, they typically found only wreckage. American aircrew learned that if they heard rescue aircraft overhead, they should signal immediately. If they heard Japanese boats approaching, they should hide or submerge, breathing through their Mae West life vests until the enemy passed. The rescue squadrons developed specialized capabilities that went beyond simple retrieval operations. They began carrying surgeons and medical equipment to treat severely injured pilots immediately after rescue. Lives were saved because treatment began hours earlier than would have been possible if the pilot had to wait for transport back to base by surface ship. They carried extra fuel and survival equipment to airdrop to pilots they could locate but could not immediately retrieve due to weather or enemy activity. A pilot floating in the Pacific who received an airdrop of a larger life raft, food, water, and medical supplies could survive for days until conditions permitted a rescue landing. Some missions combined rescue with reconnaissance or strike coordination. A Catalina searching for a downed pilot would simultaneously photograph Japanese installations, report on shipping movements, or direct other aircraft to targets of opportunity. This multi-mission capability meant that even unsuccessful rescue flights contributed valuable intelligence. The Catalinas became known as the eyes of the fleet, flying where faster aircraft could not go, seeing things that other observation platforms missed, and providing information that influenced operational planning. The relationship between rescue crews and the pilots they saved created bonds that lasted beyond the war. Fighter pilots and bomber crews knew the rescue squadrons by reputation and by name. They knew which Catalina crews had the most rescues, which pilots would land in the worst conditions, which squadrons had the best track record. This created a culture of mutual respect. The fighter pilots flying high-performance aircraft appreciated the courage of men flying obsolete flying boats into danger zones. The rescue crews took pride in their role and in the knowledge that their work mattered in ways that could be measured in lives saved. By September 1944, as American forces prepared for the liberation of the Philippines, 6 dedicated rescue squadrons were operating throughout the Pacific. They had collectively saved over 1,500 airmen since the beginning of organized rescue operations 18 months earlier. The number would double before the war ended. Each squadron had developed its own traditions and specialties. Some were known for long-range searches in the northern Pacific. Others specialized in rescues under fire near heavily defended Japanese bases. All shared the same mission and the same commitment to bringing every possible airman home alive. The scale of operations continued expanding as the war intensified. During the Philippines campaign that began in October 1944, rescue squadrons flew continuously, sometimes launching multiple missions per day to keep pace with the air operations overhead. The skies above Leyte Gulf and Luzon filled with American aircraft, and inevitably, some were shot down. The rescue squadrons became a critical component of the air campaign, enabling commanders to sustain sortie rates that would have been impossible without the knowledge that downed pilots would be recovered. The success rate was extraordinary. Of all pilots reported down in areas where rescue operations were possible, meaning they were not too deep in enemy territory or too far out to sea, over 70% were successfully recovered alive. This was a dramatic improvement from the less than 10% recovery rate before dedicated rescue squadrons existed. The difference represented thousands of experienced combat pilots who continued fighting rather than being lost to the ocean. The cost to the rescue squadrons themselves was significant but sustainable. Catalinas were occasionally shot down by enemy fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Crew members died in crashes, were killed during rescue attempts in rough seas, or were lost when aircraft went missing during long overwater flights in storms. The casualty rate in rescue squadrons was actually lower than in fighter or bomber units because the Catalinas avoided direct combat when possible. But the missions were still dangerous, and losses occurred regularly enough to remind everyone that the work carried real risks. The recognition for what these men accomplished came slowly. Rescue missions did not generate the dramatic footage or exciting stories that fighter combat or bombing raids produced. The work was often tedious, hours of searching followed by a few minutes of controlled chaos. But within the fleet, the rescue squadrons were held in the highest regard. Admirals and generals understood their strategic value. Pilots and aircrew knew they were the lifeline that made dangerous missions survivable. The rescued airmen themselves never forgot the men who pulled them from the ocean and gave them a second chance at life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.